I stared at the bowl of pasta until the steam stopped rising, and then I picked up the salt shaker and didn't stop until the surface was a thick, snowy white. I wasn't seasoning it. I was making sure I couldn't eat it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just losing my mind. I was actively trying to disappear. But the real question wasn't why I was starving myself. It was why the person sleeping next to me every night seemed to be cheering for my downfall. If I left tonight without a word, without a note, and just drove until the gas ran out, would he even notice I was gone? Or would he just be annoyed that the laundry wasn't folded and the kitchen was cold? You think you know what rock bottom feels like until you realize the person who's supposed to be your safety net is actually the one holding the scissors, waiting to cut the cord. This silence in our house has become a physical weight. It's not the kind of silence that feels peaceful or restorative. It's the kind that rings in your ears, heavy with all the things we aren't saying. I'm 30 years old, and if you'd asked me 5 years ago where I'd be, I would have told you I'd be at the peak of my career, maybe thinking about starting a family, living in a home filled with laughter. Instead, I'm sitting in a dimly lit kitchen, counting the individual leaves of a head of lettuce as if my life depends on it. The descent didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, agonizing erosion. It started with the job. For years, I poured everything I had into my career. It was my dream job. I had the title, the responsibility, the respect. At least I thought I did. But about 3 years ago, the atmosphere shifted. It's hard to explain to people who haven't been through it, but a toxic work environment is like carbon monoxide. You don't see it, you don't smell it, but it's slowly suffocating you. I was placed under a microscope. Every email I sent was scrutinized for tone. Every project I delivered was met with constructive feedback that felt more like a calculated strike to my confidence. Then came the PIPs, Performance Improvement Plans. In the corporate world, those are often just the paperwork path to the exit, a way to make you feel incompetent so you won't fight back when they finally let you go. For 3 years, I lived in a state of constant, vibrating anxiety. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. with my heart racing, scrolling through my inbox to see if I'd missed an urgent demand from a manager who seemed to take a twisted pleasure in micromanaging my every breath. I stayed because I thought I was strong enough to outlast them. I stayed because I didn't want to be a quitter. But 3 months ago, something inside me just snapped. I walked out. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have another offer waiting. I just knew that if I stayed one more day, I wouldn't be around to see the next week. I chose my life over my career, but the irony is, I'm not sure how much of a life I have left. Now I've been off for 3 months, and the transition from a high-pressure career to the total vacuum of unemployment has been devastating. When you've been told you're failing for 3 years straight, you start to believe it. Every time I sit down to write a cover letter or update my resume, a voice in the back of my head, a voice that sounds suspiciously like my former boss, whispers that I'm underselling myself because there's nothing to sell. I look at my accomplishments and see a list of lies. I go into interviews and I can feel the desperation radiating off me. I'm a shell of the professional I used to be, and because I have no control over my external world, I've started seeking it elsewhere. I felt the old shadows of an eating disorder creeping back in, a ghost from my teenage years that I thought I'd buried long ago. It starts small. You tell yourself you're just being healthy or saving money. But then you're counting every single gram of lettuce. You're weighing your food on a digital scale like it's a laboratory experiment. And then there's the salt. It's my darkest secret. When the hunger gets too loud, or when the self-loathing gets too heavy, I'll cook a beautiful meal, something I should enjoy, and then I'll dump half a canister of salt on it. I make it inedible. I ruin it so I don't have to feel the guilt of consuming it. It's a punishment and a control tactic all wrapped into one. 1 meal a day is my limit. Anything more feels like a failure. You'd think that at home, with my partner, I'd find some solace. We're married. We're supposed to be a team. But our marriage is currently a battlefield where only one of us is armed. He has a high-stress job too, a massive project that's demanding every ounce of his energy. I get it. I've been there. I know what it's like to have the weight of a company on your shoulders. Because of that, I've taken on 90% of everything at home. I do the cleaning, the grocery shopping, the deep scrubbing, the errands. I want to make his life easier because I know mine is currently a mess. But instead of appreciation, I get an audit. Every time we have a disagreement, it's like he opens a ledger of my failures. I'm not moving fast enough. I'm not finding a job quick enough. I'm not contributing. It doesn't matter that the house is spotless or that I'm drowning in my own mind. It's never enough. The most painful part is how personal the attacks have become. It's not just about my lack of a paycheck anymore. He's started picking apart the way I speak. He'll mock my accent on certain words, twisting his face in a way that makes me feel like a child, or like someone who doesn't belong in her own home. When your boss tells you you're worthless, you can eventually quit. When your own brain tells you you're worthless, you can go to counseling. But when the person who promised to love and cherish you tells you, through words and actions, that you're a burden, that's a different kind of pain. It's the kind of pain that makes you look at the medicine cabinet a little too long. It's the kind of pain that makes the idea of disappearing feel less like a tragedy and more like a strategy for survival. I'm tired of fighting 2 battles every single day. I'm fighting a war against my own mind, trying to claw my way out of this depression and the grip of this eating disorder. And I'm fighting a war for my marriage, trying to prove to my husband that I still have value, even if I don't have a corporate title. I'm exhausted. I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a very tall cliff, and the wind is blowing harder every second. So, I've been thinking about a plan. Not a permanent disappearance, not yet, but I'm thinking about just leaving. No explanation, no argument, just packing a small bag, getting in the car, and going missing for a few days. I need to find out who I am when I'm not being criticized. I need to see if I can eat a meal without ruining it when there's no one around to judge me for existing. But is that a selfish move? Am I the one being toxic by wanting to vanish? Or is this the only way to save what's left of me? The morning always starts the same way now, with the sound of his alarm and the immediate, crushing weight of reality. Before I even open my eyes, I'm mentally cataloguing everything I need to do to avoid an argument. I listen to the rhythm of his breathing, trying to gauge his mood before he even says a word. Is he going to be the man I married, or the man he's become over the last 6 months? I stay under the covers, making myself as small as possible while he gets ready for work. I hear the clinking of his coffee mug, the sharp snap of his briefcase, the heavy tread of his shoes on the hardwood. Every sound feels like a countdown. Usually, he'll pop his head into the bedroom door, not to say he loves me or to wish me a good day, but to leave a list. The dry cleaning needs picking up, he'll say, his voice flat and clinical. And the downstairs bathroom is starting to look a little dusty. Since you have the time, maybe you could get to that today? Since I have the time. Those 5 words are like a serrated blade. He says them with a specific kind of inflection, a reminder that while he is out in the world, contributing and building a future, I am home, essentially a ghost in my own life. He doesn't see the hours I spend on LinkedIn, tailoring my resume until the words blur into nonsense. He doesn't see the way my hands shake every time I hit the submit button on an application, knowing that another rejection, or worse, another silence, is coming. He only sees the vacuum lines in the carpet and the lack of a paycheck in our joint account. One Tuesday, I had an interview scheduled for a mid-level management role. It was a step down from where I used to be, but at this point, I just wanted to feel useful again. I spent an hour doing my makeup, trying to hide the dark circles under my eyes and the sallow tint my skin has taken on since I stopped eating regular meals. I put on my best blazer, the one that used to make me feel like a powerhouse. But when I looked in the mirror, all I saw was a costume. The blazer was hanging off my shoulders now. I've lost so much weight that nothing fits quite right anymore. The interview was a disaster. It wasn't because I didn't know the answers. It was because I couldn't find the me they wanted. When the recruiter asked me to describe a time I overcame a challenge at work, my mind went blank. All I could think about was my old boss shouting at me in front of the entire team. All I could feel was the phantom weight of a PIP hanging over my head. I stumbled through my words, my voice thin and wavering. I could see the recruiter's expression shift from interest to pity. That's the worst part. The pity. I used to be the person people looked up to. Now I'm the person people feel sorry for. I came home that afternoon feeling like a hollowed-out tree. I just wanted to sit in the dark and breathe. But then I remembered the list. I hadn't finished the laundry. I hadn't gone to the store. I forced myself into the kitchen to start dinner, my movements robotic. I decided to make a roast, something heavy, something manly that he would like. But as I stood there chopping vegetables, the anxiety started to claw at my throat. I looked at the potatoes and saw only numbers, calories, carbs. Failure. I reached for the salt. It's almost like a ritual now. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. I just kept shaking and shaking until the vegetables were coated in a thick, crystalline crust. I knew I wouldn't be able to eat it. My tongue would shrivel at the first bite. But that was the point, wasn't it? If I couldn't eat it, I couldn't get fat. If I couldn't eat it, I was in control. It's the only thing in my life I feel like I have any say over. What goes into my body, or more accurately, what doesn't. When he got home that evening, the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. He didn't even say hello. He just dropped his bag, walked into the kitchen, and looked at the stove. "Is dinner ready?" he asked, not looking at me. "Almost," I whispered. "I had an interview today." He finally looked at me then, but there was no spark of curiosity in his eyes. "And? How did it go?" "It was okay. I'm waiting to hear back." He let out a short, sharp huff of air, a sound that has become the soundtrack to my failures. "Okay doesn't pay the mortgage, Sarah. It's been 3 months. I'm carrying everything right now. The stress at the firm is off the charts, and I come home and it's just more stress. I need you to step up. I need you to be a partner, not another person I have to manage." The words hit me like a physical blow. A partner. He thinks I'm a project. He thinks I'm a line item on his to-do list that isn't being checked off fast enough. I felt the tears stinging my eyes, and I tried to blink them back, but one escaped and tracked down my cheek. "Oh, here we go," he said, throwing his hands up. "The waterworks. Every time I try to have a serious conversation about our future, you turn into a victim. It's exhausting." "I'm not trying to be a victim," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm struggling. I'm really, really struggling. And I feel like you don't even see me anymore." "I see you," he snapped. "I see you sitting around the house while I work 12-hour days. I see you getting upset over things that shouldn't matter. And honestly, the way you say struggling, that accent of yours is getting so thick lately. It's like you're leaning into being some sort of tragic character. It's annoying." I froze. My accent? We've been together for years. He's never mentioned my accent before, other than to say it was charming when we first met. Now, it was just another flaw, another piece of me that was wrong. That night, I didn't eat at all. I sat across from him while he ate the roast. He didn't even notice the salt. Or maybe he did, and he just didn't care enough to mention it. I watched him chew and thought about what it would be like if I just wasn't there. If the chair was empty. if the house was silent. The idea of going missing didn't come to me as a grand, dramatic gesture. It came as a quiet, desperate need for air. I started imagining it in detail. I wouldn't leave a note. A note is an invitation for a conversation, and I'm so tired of talking. I wouldn't pack a big suitcase, just a backpack with some essentials. I'd wait until he left for work and then I'd just drive. I started looking at maps on my phone in the middle of the night while he slept beside me, his back turned to me like a wall. I found a small coastal town about 4 hours away, a place where nobody knows my name, nobody knows I'm unemployed, and nobody knows that I ruin my food with salt because I'm afraid to exist. I could rent a cheap motel room. I could sit on the beach and watch the waves and not have to be checked in on or critiqued, but then the guilt would creep in. Is that cruel, to let someone think you've disappeared? To let them wonder if you're dead or alive? But then I'd look at him, snoring softly, completely unaffected by the fact that his wife is crumbling into dust 3 inches away from him. And I'd wonder, would he even be scared? Or would he just be angry that I left him with the bills and the chores? I feel like I'm fighting 2 battles. One is against the world, the jobs, the expectations, the success I'm supposed to have. The other is against the people who are supposed to love me, and I'm losing both. If I stay here, I don't think I'll survive another month. The disappearing thoughts are getting louder than the searching for a job thoughts. I need to know if I'm the monster for wanting to leave without a word, or if I'm just a woman trying to keep her head above water before she drowns for good. The next morning, I went to my counselling session. It's a small, windowless office that smells faintly of lavender and old paper. The only place in the world right now where I don't feel like I'm being graded on a curve. My therapist, a woman named Eleanor, with kind eyes and a way of nodding that makes you feel heard, sat across from me while I picked at a loose thread on my sweater. I told her about the salt. I told her how I'd stood over that roast, shaking the canister until my wrist ached, watching the white grains bury the meat like a winter storm. I expected her to look horrified, or maybe to start scribbling frantically in her notebook. Instead, she just sighed softly. "Sarah," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "that salt isn't about the food. It's about the space you're allowed to take up. If you make the food inedible, you don't have to feel guilty for consuming resources. You're trying to become invisible because you feel like a burden to the people around you. But you aren't a burden. You're a human being in a crisis." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then I'd go home, and the human being in a crisis would be met with a man in a deadline. When I walked through our front door after the session, the house felt colder than usual. My husband was home early, which is usually a cause for celebration, but lately it just feels like an early start to the interrogation. He was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open, the blue light reflecting off his glasses, making him look like a stranger. "How was therapy?" he asked, putting the word in invisible air quotes. "It was fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We talked about coping mechanisms." "Coping mechanisms," he repeated, finally looking up. "You know what a good coping mechanism would be? A paycheck. I saw an email from the electric company today. Rates are going up. Are you still applying for those senior roles? Or are you still underselling yourself to entry-level positions because you're scared?" I felt the familiar heat of shame rising in my chest. "I'm trying, Mark. I had an interview yesterday, remember? I'm waiting to hear back." "You've been waiting to hear back for 12 weeks, Sarah. At what point do we admit that maybe you're just not trying hard enough? Or maybe you've just gotten too comfortable being a housewife? Though, honestly, if this is you being a housewife, the standards are pretty low. Did you see the pile of mail on the side table? It's been sitting there for 3 days. I looked at the mail. It was a stack of flyers and junk envelopes. It would have taken me 30 seconds to move it. But in my mind, that stack of mail felt like a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb. Every small task feels like a marathon when you're running on 1 meal a day and 3 hours of sleep. "I'll get to it," I whispered. "That's your motto lately, isn't it? I'll get to it." Well, I can't get to the mortgage. I have to pay it every month, while you sit here and, what, salt your food so you don't have to eat? Yeah, I saw you doing that the other night. It's pathetic, Sarah. It's attention-seeking behaviour, and I don't have the bandwidth for it. The air left the room. He saw. He saw the salt, and he didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask if I was hurting. He called it pathetic. He called it attention-seeking. In that moment, the plan to leave shifted from a fantasy to a necessity. If he thought I was seeking attention, I would give him the exact opposite. I would give him total, deafening silence. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just turned around, walked into the laundry room, and started folding the clothes he'd complained about. I did it with a strange, icy calm. Every shirt I folded felt like a step toward the door. I realized then that I wasn't fighting for my marriage anymore. I was just trying to survive it long enough to make my exit. That night, while he was in the shower, I did something I've never done before. I checked our joint savings. I wanted to see how much my money was left, the money I'd earned during those years of high-pressure corporate hell. There was enough. I wouldn't be stealing from him. I'd be taking what was mine. I transferred a few $100s to my personal account, just enough for a few nights in a motel and some gas. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was pale, my eyes sunken. I looked like a woman who was already gone. I started thinking about the logistics. If I left on Friday morning, right after he headed to the office, I'd have an 8-hour head start. He wouldn't be home until at least 7 or 8. By the time he realized I wasn't just out for a walk, I'd be 4 states away. But then the good girl inside me, the one who's been conditioned to be a people pleaser, the one who worked herself to the point of a breakdown, started screaming. "You can't just leave. It's irresponsible. People will worry. The police might get involved. You'll be the crazy wife everyone talks about." But what about the crazy husband who mocks his wife's accent while she's drowning? What about the loving partner who watches his spouse starve herself and calls it pathetic? Where is the accountability for that? I went back into the bedroom and lay on the very edge of the mattress, making sure no part of my body touched his. I stared at the ceiling and practiced my going missing plan in my head. I'd take my phone, but I'd turn off the location. No, better yet, I'd leave the phone here. If I had the phone, I'd be tempted to check his messages. I'd be tempted to see if he was sorry. And if he wasn't, if the messages were just more demands and insults, it would break the last piece of me that's still holding together. I thought about the beach I'd found online, a little place called Gray's Harbour. The pictures showed grey skies and churning dark water. It looked exactly like I felt. I imagined standing on the pier, the wind whipping my hair, the salt in the air being the only salt I had to deal with. No judgments, no lists, no performances to improve. As I drifted off to sleep, a terrifying thought entered my mind. What if I go and he doesn't call the police? What if I go for 3 days and when I come back, he hasn't even noticed I was gone? Or worse, what if he's happier without me? The fear of being missed is nothing compared to the fear of being forgotten while you're still standing in the room. I woke up the next morning with a singular focus. It was Wednesday, 2 days left. I had to be perfect for 2 more days. I had to be the good wife. I had to make sure the house was spotless so he wouldn't have a reason to be angry. I had to make sure dinner was on the table, perfectly seasoned, not oversalted, not for him, so he wouldn't suspect a thing. I spent the day cleaning. I scrubbed floors until my knees were bruised. I polished the silverware. I even organised his sock drawer. It was like I was preparing the house for my own funeral. If I was going to disappear, I wanted to leave behind a version of myself that he couldn't find a single flaw in. I wanted him to look around the empty house and realize that the person he'd been treating like a servant was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. But as I was cleaning the guest room, I found something. In the back of the closet, tucked away in an old shoebox, was a photo from our wedding day. We were standing on the steps of the courthouse, laughing. I looked so full of life. My skin was glowing, my hair was thick, and I was looking at him like he was the sun. And he was looking at me the same way. What happened to those people? How did we go from that to this? I sat on the floor of the guest room, clutching the photo. And for the first time in months, I didn't just leak a few tears. I sobbed. I sobbed for the career I lost, for the body I'm destroying, and for the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. I realized then that going missing wasn't just about a vacation. It was a test. I was going to go missing to see if the man in that photo still existed somewhere deep inside the stranger I was living with. And if he didn't, then I wasn't just going missing for a few days. I was going missing for good. Thursday was the longest day of my life. It was the day I spent being a ghost in my own home, haunting the rooms I was about to leave behind. I cleaned with a feverish intensity, scrubbing the baseboards and polishing the mirrors until the house smelled like lemon oil and bleach, a sterile, artificial scent that covered up the smell of decay. I made a decision that morning. I wouldn't salt his dinner. I would make him one last perfect meal, a parting gift he wouldn't even know was a goodbye. I spent the afternoon preparing a beef bourguignon, the kind that takes hours to simmer, filling the house with a rich, savoury aroma that used to mean home. I didn't taste it once. I didn't need to. I knew the recipe by heart, and besides, the very idea of food made my stomach twist into a knot. When Mark walked through the door at 7, he didn't even drop his bag before he started. I hope you did something productive today, Sarah. The firm is leaning on me hard, and I don't want to come home to a mess. The house is clean, Mark, I said, my voice eerily calm. And dinner is on the table. He paused, sniffing the air. For a second, just a tiny fraction of a second, I saw a flicker of the old Mark, the one who used to hug me from behind while I cooked. But then he sat down, opened his laptop, and started typing. Good, he said, not looking up. Did you hear back about that job? The one you undersold yourself for? No, I lied. I had actually received a rejection email that afternoon, but I didn't care anymore. That version of Sarah, the one who cared about titles and paychecks, was already packing her bags. We ate in silence, the only sound the clinking of his fork against the ceramic plate. I sat across from him with a small bowl of plain, unseasoned spinach, forcing myself to swallow every bite. I needed the energy for the drive. You're actually eating, he noted, glancing at my bowl. See? Was it that hard? All that drama with the salt was just for show, wasn't it? I didn't answer. I just looked at him. Really looked at him. I looked at the way he chewed, the way he frowned at his screen, the way he completely ignored the fact that his wife was a shell of a human being. I realised then that if I died in that chair, he'd probably just be annoyed that I hadn't finished the dishes first. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the digital clock as the red numbers ticked away. 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Every hour felt like a mile marker on a highway I hadn't started driving yet. I thought about my parents, my friends, people I'd pulled away from over the last 3 years as my life spiraled. I felt a pang of guilt for what I was about to do to them. But then I remembered that none of them had called in weeks. I'd become the sad friend, the one who was always going through a tough time, and people eventually get tired of that. They stop checking in because they don't know what to say. Friday morning arrived with a cold, grey light. Mark was in a rush as usual. He spilled coffee on the counter and didn't wipe it up. He barked a reminder at me to call the insurance company about a claim we were filing. "I'll see you at 8, he said, heading for the door. He didn't kiss me. He didn't even look at me. Make sure you've got something sorted for dinner. I've got a late meeting. I'll see you, Mark, I said. It wasn't a lie. He just didn't know when he'd see me. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, the silence in the house shifted. It was no longer heavy. It was expectant. I moved with a strange, clinical efficiency. I had my backpack hidden in the guest room closet. I put in 3 changes of clothes, my journal, a thick sweater, and my toiletries. I walked into the kitchen and looked at my phone sitting on the marble island. This was the hardest part. My phone was my connection to everything. My therapist, my few remaining friends, the job alerts I was still obsessed with. But it was also my leash. If I took it, he could track me. If I took it, he could call me and scream, or worse, he could text me something sweet and pull me back into the cycle. I turned it off. The screen went black, reflecting my own pale face. I tucked it into the junk drawer, hidden under a pile of menus and spare keys. I took my car keys and my wallet. I checked the joint account one last time on my laptop. I'd already withdrawn the cash I needed. I left the house exactly as it was. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a sign. I just walked out the front door, locked it, and stepped into the cool morning air. As I backed the car out of the driveway, my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. I felt like a criminal. I felt like a fugitive. But as I turned the corner and the house disappeared from my rearview mirror, a sensation I hadn't felt in years washed over me. It wasn't happiness. It was far too early for that. It was lightness. I drove toward the highway, merging into the flow of commuters. Everyone else was going to work, to meetings, to lives they were building or maintaining. I was the only one going nowhere. About 2 hours into the drive, the good girl voice started screaming again. Go back. Turn around. He's going to be so angry. You're ruining everything. What if something happens to him? What if he thinks you've been kidnapped? I pulled over at a rest stop, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I sat there in the parking lot, watching families go into the vending area and truck drivers stretching their legs. I felt like I was watching a movie of a world I no longer belonged to. I reached for my phone before remembering I'd left it in the kitchen drawer. The phantom limb of technology was startling. I felt naked, vulnerable. But then I looked at the passenger seat where my physical map was spread out, a real paper map I'd bought at a gas station. I had circled Grays Harbor in red ink. I took a deep breath. The air in the car smelled like stale coffee and old upholstery. But it was my air. There was no judgment here. No one was mocking my accent. No one was telling me I was pathetic for struggling to eat. I put the car back in gear and kept driving. The scenery started to change. The suburban sprawl gave way to rolling hills, and then eventually the trees started to look different, gnarled and salt-blown. The air through the vents grew cooler, smelling of brine and damp earth. I reached Grays Harbor just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows over the water. It was exactly as the pictures had promised, a rugged, lonely place. The town was small, mostly bait shops and weathered cottages with peeling paint. I found a motel called the Sea Gazer. It was a low, U-shaped building with neon signs that flickered in the dusk. The woman at the front desk was older, with skin like parchment and a kind of tired indifference that I found incredibly comforting. She didn't care who I was or why a woman with a high-end SUV was checking into a $40 a night room with only a backpack. Room 12, she said, sliding a heavy brass key across the counter. Ice machine is around the corner. Checkout is at 11. Thank you, I whispered. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. I hadn't spoken to anyone since Mark left that morning. I walked to my room, the salt air stinging my cheeks. Inside, the room was basic. A queen bed with a floral polyester bedspread, a small TV, and a window that looked out over the dunes toward the ocean. It was perfect. It was a blank space. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the clock on the bedside table. 6:30 p.m. Back home, Mark would be finishing his late meeting. In an hour, he'd be walking through the front door. He'd see the lights off. He'd see the cold kitchen. He'd call my name, his voice probably already tinged with irritation that dinner wasn't ready. He'd check the bedroom. He'd check the bathroom. He'd see my phone in the drawer. And then what? Would he panic? Would he call the police? Or would he just sit on the sofa, order a pizza, and wait for me to crawl back and apologize for my attention-seeking behavior? I lay back on the bed, staring at the popcorn ceiling. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the urge to salt anything. I just felt empty. A clean, quiet kind of empty. I closed my eyes and listened to the distant roar of the waves, wondering if the woman who left that morning would ever be the same woman who eventually went back, if she went back at all. Have you ever experienced a silence so loud it actually makes your ears ring? That's what the first night in room 12 sounded like. For the past 3 years, my life had been a chaotic symphony of demands. The pinging of urgent emails at midnight, the harsh ring of my old boss's phone calls, the heavy, impatient sighs of my husband when I didn't fold his shirts the right way. My nervous system was so used to being in a constant state of fight or flight that lying on that cheap, floral motel bed in total silence felt physically dangerous. My brain kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I lay there in the dark, watching the neon sign from the parking lot blink through the thin curtains, casting a sickly pink glow across the ceiling. Every time a car drove past on the coastal highway, my heart would leap into my throat. Is it him? Did he find me? Did he track the car? But the cars just kept rolling by, their headlights sweeping across the walls like searchlights before fading into the damp, salty night. To keep myself from spiraling, I started playing a dangerous game. I started building a timeline in my head of what was happening back home. It was 8:30 p.m. Mark was probably turning his key in the lock right now. He'd pushed the door open, dropping his heavy leather briefcase on the entryway table. He'd expect the smell of roasted garlic or seared meat, but instead, he'd be met with nothing but the sharp, sterile scent of bleach and lemon polish. He'd walk into the kitchen, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He'd see the empty stove. He'd see the spotless counters. "Sarah!" He'd call out, his voice echoing in the empty house. He'd check the living room, then march up the stairs, the annoyance morphing into a simmering anger. He'd open the bedroom door, expecting to find me curled up in bed, sulking or playing the victim. But the bed would be perfectly made, the sheets pulled tight, completely undisturbed. By 9 p.m, he'd be angry. He'd pull out his phone and dial my number. I imagined the muffled buzzing of my phone, buried under the takeout menus in the junk drawer downstairs. Would he hear it? Would he follow the sound, rip open the drawer and see the black screen? What would his face look like in that exact moment? Would it be fear? Or would it just be the supreme irritation of a man who realized his personal assistant had walked off the job without giving 2 weeks' notice? I tortured myself with these thoughts until my stomach let out a hollow, painful cramp. It was a sharp reminder that I hadn't eaten anything but a bowl of plain spinach in over 24 hours. My body was quite literally eating itself. Normally, this is the part where I would go to the kitchen, find the most mundane, flavorless thing I could, and drown it in salt until my tongue went numb. But there was no kitchen here. There was just a mini fridge that smelled faintly of mildew and an ice bucket. If I wanted to eat, I had to leave the room. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the biting coastal wind. A few blocks down the road, there was a small 24-hour diner, the kind of place with faded red vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and a glass display case holding pies that looked like they'd been baked in another decade. I pushed the heavy glass door open, the bell jingling cheerfully above me. There were only 2 other people inside, an older man in a trucker hat nursing a black coffee, and a waitress behind the counter wiping down the laminate surface with a rag. She looked up and offered a tired but genuine smile. "Anywhere you like, hun," she called out. I chose a booth in the far back corner, sliding into the cold vinyl. The menu was sticky, laminated, and filled with pictures of heavy, greasy comfort food. A year ago, the sheer calorie count of a place like this would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. Even yesterday, I would have scanned the menu for a plain garden salad and then asked for it without dressing, without croutons, without joy. But as I sat there, a strange, rebellious spark ignited in my chest. Nobody was watching me. Mark wasn't sitting across from me, eyeing my plate and making a subtle, passive-aggressive comment about how I had plenty of free time to work off those carbs. My old boss wasn't in my head, telling me I didn't deserve a lunch break because my metrics were down. "What can I get ya?" the waitress asked, pulling a notepad from her apron. Her name tag read, Barb. "I'll have the grilled cheese," I heard myself say. My voice trembled slightly. "And a bowl of tomato soup, please." Barb didn't blink. She didn't judge me. "You got it, sweetie. Coffee?" "Yes, thank you." When she walked away, my eyes immediately darted to the edge of the table. There it was, the salt shaker. A little glass tower with a dented metal lid. The enemy. The weapon. I stared at it, my hands shaking in my lap. The urge to grab it was overwhelming. It was an addiction, a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. If I ruined the food, I was safe. If I ruined the food, I was in control. 10 minutes later, Barb set the steaming bowl of soup and the golden brown sandwich in front of me. The smell was intoxicating. It smelled like childhood. It smelled like warmth. I reached my hand out. My fingers hovered over the salt shaker. I could hear my heart thudding in my ears. "Cheat a little," my brain whispered. "Just enough to make it taste bad. You don't deserve this. You're unemployed. You abandoned your husband. You're a failure. Punish yourself." But then another voice broke through. A voice that sounded suspiciously like Elena, my therapist, but also a little bit like the old me, the woman in the courthouse wedding photo. "You are a human being in a crisis. You are allowed to take up space." I pulled my hand back. I picked up the spoon instead. I dipped it into the soup and took a bite. The rich, tangy flavour of the tomato exploded on my tongue, completely unmasked by a blizzard of sodium. It was warm. It was perfect. I took a bite of the grilled cheese, the buttery, crispy bread melting in my mouth. I closed my eyes, and right there, in the middle of a dingy diner at 2 a.m, the dam finally broke. A single tear slipped down my cheek, followed by another and another. I wasn't just crying because the food was good. I was crying because for the first time in 3 years, I was doing something solely to nourish myself, and I wasn't apologizing for it. I ate the entire meal, every last crumb, and when I was done, the sky outside the diner window was beginning to turn a bruised violet grey. Morning was coming. I paid my bill, left a large tip for Barb, and walked straight past my motel toward the beach. The ocean was wild and angry, churning with whitecaps under a heavy, overcast sky. The wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks with sea spray. I walked down to the water's edge, my boots sinking into the wet, freezing sand. I looked out at the endless expanse of grey water, feeling incredibly small. But for the first time in forever, feeling small wasn't a bad thing. In the corporate world and in my marriage, I was made to feel small as a punishment. I was minimized, micromanaged, and belittled until I shrank to fit the tiny box they built for me. But here, standing before the sheer, violent power of the Pacific Ocean, my smallness was just a fact of nature. The ocean didn't care about my resume. The ocean didn't care how thick my accent was. The ocean just was. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, briny air, and without planning to, I opened my mouth and screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. GDK was a scream of years of pent-up frustration. I screamed for the promotions GDK has denied. I screamed for the anxiety attacks in bathroom stalls. I screamed for the potatoes I ruined with salt. I screamed for the husband who looked at me like I was a broken appliance GDK didn't have the receipt to return. GDK. I screamed until my throat was raw and my lungs burned, my voice completely swallowed by the roar of the crashing waves. And when I finally stopped, gasping for breath, my knees gave out. I dropped into the wet sand, wrapping my arms around myself, and I realized something profound. All those times I thought about disappearing, all those times I looked at the medicine cabinet and wondered if it would just be easier to go to sleep and never wake up. I didn't actually want to die. I just desperately, painfully wanted the life I was currently living to die. I wanted the toxic marriage to die. I wanted the self-loathing to die. The real me, the woman who loved her career, who loved her husband before he turned into a spreadsheet-obsessed stranger, who loved grilled cheese sandwiches, she wanted to live. She had just been buried alive under years of criticism and starvation. I sat on that beach until the sun fully broke through the clouds, casting a pale, cold light over the shore. I had survived day one. I had eaten a meal. I had found my voice, even if I only used it to yell at the ocean. But as the adrenaline faded and the cold seeped into my bones, reality came crashing back down like the tide. It was Saturday morning. Mark had now been without me for a full 24 hours. He had undoubtedly found the phone. The shock would have worn off by now, replaced by whatever action he deemed necessary. Did he call my parents? Did he call the police? Was my face already being plastered on local Facebook groups? Or was he sitting in the living room, drinking his coffee, entirely unbothered, just waiting for me to get over my tantrum and come home to do the laundry? The thought of his apathy terrified me more than the thought of his anger. I stood up, brushing the wet sand off my jeans, and started the long walk back to room 12. I had a decision to make. I couldn't stay in this motel forever. My cash would run out. Eventually, I'd have to turn on a phone, look at a screen, and face the fallout of my disappearance. But as I put the heavy brass key into the door of my room, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting for me back in that house, I was not going to be the same woman who walked out of it. The motel room was still, the air stale and heavy, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a bunker, a place I had retreated to in order to survive the war. I collapsed onto the edge of the bed and stared at the patterned wallpaper, the peeling corners of which seemed to hold the secrets of every lonely traveller who had stayed here before me. I felt a strange, detached curiosity about them. Did they have a mark back home? Did they have a boss who measured their worth in KPIs and PIPs? Did they have a voice in their head telling them they were better off not existing? My stomach felt settled for the first time in weeks. That grilled cheese and tomato soup from the diner had been more than just food. It had been an act of rebellion. I had fed myself, and I hadn't punished myself for it. I hadn't reached for the salt. I hadn't counted the calories until my eyes burned. I had just eaten. I looked at my watch, a habit I couldn't seem to break. It was 9 a.m. Back in the city, the weekend had started. In my old life, Saturday was the catch-up day. I'd spend the morning tidying, then spend the afternoon running errands for him, then prepare a nice dinner that would inevitably end with him critiquing my performance as a wife. I imagined him waking up, rolling over to an empty side of the bed, and reaching out to find only cold sheets. What would he do? Would he be annoyed? Would he call my cell phone, his voice dripping with that familiar, clipped irritation, asking where I was because he couldn't find the spare keys, or because the trash hadn't been taken out? I realised with a jolt of clarity that I didn't care. I didn't care if he was angry. I didn't care if he was confused. I didn't even care if he was scared. For the first time, the good girl was dead. The part of me that lived to manage his moods, to absorb his stress, and to apologize for existing was finally blessedly silent. I stood up and walked to the small bathroom mirror. I looked at myself, really looked at myself, for the first time in months. The woman staring back was gaunt, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes rimmed with dark, permanent circles. She looked like a ghost, but there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of something hard, something forged in the cold water of the Pacific. I picked up the travel toothbrush I'd packed, the only piece of my old life I'd brought with me, and I started brushing my teeth. I moved slowly, deliberately. I looked at my reflection and I said out loud, I am not going back to the way it was. GK's voice was thin, but it didn't shake. I spent the next 3 hours in the motel room, doing something I hadn't done since I was 22. I made a list. But it wasn't a list of chores or job applications. It was a list of truths. I am not a project to be managed. I am not a failure because I lost my job due to a toxic environment. My worth is not tied to the cleanliness of my kitchen or the tone of my accent. I am allowed to eat. I am allowed to be angry. As I wrote these things down in my notebook, I felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of depression that had been crushing me for months start to fray at the edges. It wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking in the corners. But it wasn't absolute anymore. Then the inevitable thought hit. I needed to know. I had to know what had happened back home. If I was going to move forward, I had to face the wreckage. I pulled my backpack off the floor and dug into the bottom, past my spare sweater and my notebook, until I found the charger for my phone. I had left the phone itself in the junk drawer at home, but I knew I couldn't keep living like a fugitive forever. I needed to see if he had reached out. I needed to know if he had even realized I was gone. I didn't have another phone, and I didn't want to use my own. But I remembered the woman at the front desk. She had mentioned that the motel had a computer in the lobby for guests to use. I grabbed my coat and headed out. The morning air was crisp and smelled of salt and rotting seaweed, a scent that felt like a baptism. I walked into the lobby. The woman from the night before was there, reading a paperback thriller, her glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Morning, honey," she said, not looking up from her book. "Sleep all right?" "Yes, thank you," I said. "Is it okay if I use the computer for a few minutes?" "Help yourself. It's a bit slow, but it gets the job done." I sat down at the clunky, ancient monitor. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from hunger or fear. It was from a cold, sharp anticipation. I logged into my personal email. There were dozens of notifications, newsletters, LinkedIn job alerts, marketing spam. And then, there they were. The emails from Mark. The first one was time-stamped Friday at 7:45 p.m. Subject: Dinner? "Sarah, are you at the grocery store? You didn't leave a note. Dinner is stone cold and the house is a mess. Call me." The second one, from 9:30 p.m. "This isn't funny. Where are you? If you're at your sister's, tell her to quit encouraging you. This is ridiculous. I have a project due Monday and I don't have time to play games. Get home." The third, from 11 p.m. "I'm calling the police in an hour if I don't hear from you. Stop being a child." And the last one, sent at 6 a.m. on Saturday. "Fine. Stay gone. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but you're only making yourself look unstable. Don't expect me to come looking for you. I have enough on my plate. When you're ready to grow up and come back, let me know. The house is a disaster, and the dog is going to need a walk." I sat there, staring at the screen, and I felt a strange, cold laugh bubble up in my throat. He wasn't worried. He wasn't scared that I'd been kidnapped or hurt. He was inconvenienced. He was annoyed because he had to walk the dog. I looked at the final email again. "Don't expect me to come looking for you." He had given me exactly what I wanted. He had given me my freedom, handed to me on a silver platter of arrogance. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I didn't send a single word. I just closed the browser, logged out, and stood up. "Everything all right, dear?" the woman at the desk asked, looking up from her book with a flicker of genuine concern. I looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt a genuine, unburdened smile touch my lips. "Yes," I said, "everything is perfect." I walked out of the lobby and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the coast. I had no job, no home to go back to, and no idea what the next month would look like. But as I stood there in the middle of the parking lot, I realized that I wasn't going missing anymore. I was just moving on. I wasn't a victim, and I wasn't a project. I was just Sarah. And for the first time in a long, long time, I was enough. The next few days at the Sea Gazer moved at a pace I had never known. Time, which had previously been a series of high-stakes, pressure-filled blocks measured in tasks completed or emails sent, turned into something fluid and soft. I fell into a rhythm that centered entirely around my own survival, not the performative, frantic kind of survival I had practiced at home, but the quiet, intentional act of existing for myself. I started taking long, aimless walks along the coastline at dawn. I didn't care if it was raining or if the wind was cutting through my coat. I just walked, watching the way the tide pulled back to reveal the hidden life of the ocean floor. Crabs, anemones, bits of sea glass and discarded shells. It felt like a metaphor for my own life. Everything I thought was essential, the career, the house, the marriage, had been pulled back by the tide, and what remained was raw, exposed, and surprisingly resilient. I kept checking my laptop at the motel's lobby, but the emails from Mark had stopped. He hadn't called the police. He hadn't come to find me. He hadn't even sent a text to check if I was alive. And in the most twisted, painful way possible, that was the most liberating thing that could have happened. It confirmed everything I had feared and everything I had needed to know. I wasn't his partner. I was an asset that had gone missing. And since the asset wasn't currently performing, it wasn't worth the effort of recovery. One afternoon, while sitting on the dunes, I pulled out my journal. I began to write, not just the list of truths I'd made, but a raw, unfiltered history of the last 3 years. I wrote about the toxic meetings, the soul-crushing weight of the PIPs, and the way the salt-ruined meals had been my only way of screaming for help without making a sound. Writing it all down, seeing the ink on the paper, drained the power from those memories. They stopped being ghosts that haunted my sleep and started being chapters in a book that was closing. I realized that my depression hadn't been a weakness. It had been a biological response to an environment that was fundamentally incompatible with my humanity. I wasn't broken. I was a perfectly healthy person reacting to a broken situation. And my eating disorder? It was just the only thing in my life I felt I had the authority to control. When you are stripped of your professional agency and your personal voice, you start regulating the one thing that can't be taken from you, your intake. On my 4th day there, I had a realization that hit me while I was eating a simple bowl of oatmeal in the diner. Barb, the waitress, stopped by to refill my coffee. She looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You look different than you did on Tuesday, hun. A little less haunted." I looked at her, startled. "Do I?" "Yeah," she said, leaning against the counter. "Like you finally stopped holding your breath." I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. I had been tensing my muscles, waiting for a criticism, waiting for a demand, waiting for someone to point out that I was doing something wrong. "I think I did," I whispered. That afternoon, I did something I had been terrified of. I opened my phone, which I had retrieved from my bag. It had been off for days. I turned it on, expecting a barrage of panicked notifications, but there was nothing. No frantic missed calls from Mark, no desperate texts from family. It was a vacuum. I opened my banking app and saw that he hadn't even checked to see if I'd touched our account. He was so busy with his project that he hadn't noticed his entire life had drifted out to sea. I felt a surge of cold, crystal-clear resolve. I didn't hate him. I realized, with a strange sense of peace, that I didn't even have the energy for hate. Hate is an active emotion, and Mark was currently a stagnant one. I just felt a profound, aching pity for the version of me that had stayed as long as she did. I sent a single short email to his address. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't DDK money. I'm taking time to figure out what I need. Do not look for me. I'll be in touch regarding the house and the next steps when I'm ready. I hope your project goes well. I hit send, then immediately blocked his number. I didn't want the notifications. I didn't want the, "I'm sorry, I was just stressed," texts that I knew would inevitably follow once he realized he actually had to handle the laundry and the dog by himself. I felt the weight of the world shift off my shoulders. I was 30 years old, unemployed, and living in a motel on the coast. But for the first time in my entire adult life, I was free. I decided to stay at the motel for 1 more week. I had enough savings to cover it, and I needed the space to rebuild my foundations before I stepped back into the world. I started applying for jobs again, but this time the tone of my applications was different. I wasn't writing as a desperate, broken woman trying to prove her worth to a corporate machine. I was writing as someone who had walked through hell and survived. I highlighted my skills, my experience, and my resilience. I didn't undersell myself. I didn't apologize for my employment gap. I simply stated my value. And the responses were immediate. People didn't see a broken candidate. They saw a woman who sounded centered, clear, and capable. I had 3 interviews lined up for the following week, all of them remote or located in cities far away from the life I was leaving behind. But the most important change wasn't the job hunt. It was the food. I stopped weighing my portions. I stopped the salt rituals. I started eating when I was hungry and stopping when I was full. I treated my body like a partner instead of an enemy. It was a slow process, and some days were harder than others, but the ghost of the ED was getting quieter, drowned out by the sound of the ocean and the simple pleasure of a meal enjoyed without fear. I had been planning to go missing as a temporary fix, a way to clear my head for a few days before returning to the battlefield. But as the days turned into a week, I knew there was no going back to that house. There was no going back to that marriage. There was no going back to the woman who thought she was a burden. I was becoming a new version of myself. Someone who knew that if a door is locked and you're being told you're not allowed to open it, you don't just sit and wait. You walk away. You find a new door. I looked at the ocean from the window of room 12, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. I was finally breathing. And I wasn't going to stop now. The final 3 days at the Sea Gazer felt like a slow-motion shedding of a second skin. Every morning I would wake up and reflexively scan the room for a list of demands. Had I fed the dog? Had I checked the mail? Had I prepaid the utility bill? Only to realize with a jolt of quiet adrenaline that there was nothing. No demands, no expectations. Just me, a half-empty notebook, and the rhythmic, grounding sound of the Pacific. I spent my final afternoon in the motel lobby. The woman at the front desk, whose name I eventually learned was Clara, was sitting in the same spot, reading a thick novel. When I walked up to the counter, she looked up, her expression a mix of curiosity and something that almost looked like pride. "You're checking out tomorrow, aren't you, honey?" she asked, her voice low. "I am," I said. "I've got a couple of interviews lined up in the city, and I think it's time to head back. Just not to where I came from." Clara pushed her glasses up her nose and offered me a rare, knowing smile. "I've seen a lot of people pass through this motel, Sarah. People running from their problems, people looking for something they lost, people just trying to find a place where nobody knows their name. You came in here looking like you were carrying the weight of the entire world on your shoulders. You're leaving a little lighter." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I think I'm leaving a different person, Clara." "That's the best way to leave," she said. I went back to my room and packed my bag. It was the same bag I'd brought with me, but it felt different now. It didn't contain a fugitive's belongings. It contained the foundation of a new life. I had my resume printed out, the one where I didn't hide my 3-month gap, but instead called it a period of personal realignment. I had my journal, filled with the truths I'd discovered in the quiet. And most importantly, I had a plan. I wasn't returning to the house to talk. I had realized that closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you give yourself. I had already left. The life I'd lived with Mark was a closed chapter, one that I didn't need to read again. I knew what it ended with. More of the same. More salt, more silence, more feeling like a ghost. But as I reached for my phone to call a friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, a notification popped up on the screen. It was an email from Mark. "I'm coming to get you. I've called your mother. I've tracked your car. This ends now. You don't get to just walk out on our life because you're having a breakdown. I'm arriving at 6 p.m. The old Sarah, the one who spent 3 years being micromanaged and belittled, would have felt a surge of panic. My heart would have started racing, my breath would have hitched, and I would have been halfway to the car, terrified of the confrontation. I would have been worried about how to explain myself, how to soothe his anger, how to manage the crisis. But the Sarah who had screamed at the ocean, who had eaten a grilled cheese sandwich without shame, and who had finally realized that she was a human being in a crisis rather than a burden. She didn't feel panic. She felt a cold, sharp clarity. He was coming to get me. He wasn't coming to apologize. He wasn't coming to ask if I was okay. He was coming to reclaim an asset, to force a return to the status quo. I didn't panic. I didn't pack in a rush. I stood up and walked to the motel office. I found Clara. "Clara," I said, my voice steady. "My husband is coming here. He's looking for me. I don't want to see him. Is there a back way out of the property, or a place where I can stay for 1 more hour until he hopefully gives up and leaves?" Clara looked at me, then at the entrance of the motel. Her face hardened, the kind of look a woman gives when she's seen a predator before. "There's a small storage road behind the cabins that leads to the main highway. He won't see you, and if he comes in here looking for you, he's going to have a very long, very loud conversation with me about harassment." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from fear, but from relief. "Thank you, Clara. Thank you so much. Go," she said, nodding toward the back. "Live your life, honey. Don't let him take it back." I grabbed my bag, checked out, and slipped out the back of the property. As I drove onto the highway, I didn't look back at the motel. I didn't look back at the life I was leaving behind. I just drove. I'm currently writing this from a small rental apartment in a city 3 hours away. I have a new job, a new routine, and a kitchen where I cook meals that actually taste like food. No salt, no misery, just ingredients. I haven't heard from Mark since that day, though I know through my mother that he was furious for a while. He still doesn't understand. He still thinks I was unstable and that I gave up on us. But that's okay. He doesn't need to understand. I do. I'm finally free. And looking back, I realized that the most important thing I ever did wasn't getting the job or moving the apartment. It was realizing that I didn't have to apologize for existing, and that sometimes the only way to save yourself is to leave the burning building behind without looking back to see who's left inside. What about you? Have you ever felt like you were drowning in a life that wasn't yours? What's the one thing you've been too afraid to change because you were worried about what people would think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're still fighting a battle you know you're going to lose, remember, you're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to start over. You're allowed to be more than just a supporting character in someone else's story. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe for more. Your support helps me keep telling these stories. not just to vent, but to remind everyone that your voice matters and your life is yours to live, regardless of what the lists say.